Full of life now, compact, visible. I, 40 years old, the 83rd year of the States, to one a century hence, or any number of centuries hence, to you yet unborn these, seeking you. When you read these, I that was visible and become invisible. Now it is you, compact, visible, realizing my poems, seeking me, fancying how happy you were if I could be with you and become your comrade. Be it as if I were with you. Be not too certain, but I am now with you.
Ho-dee-oh, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are beginning our cluster on books about the United States of America. And we're starting with one of our favorites, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And we're going to be releasing this episode on May 31st, 2019, which will be the 200th anniversary of Walt's birthday.
Happy birthday, Walt.
Happy birthday.
A lot of people are celebrating it. I noticed that there are a lot of events going on of different sorts, reading of his work and so on. And while you always see that kind of thing commemorating an important anniversary of a writer, it's kind of neat to see the affective outpouring, like the emotion that goes into it. And I think that's just something that's very specific to this writer.
Yeah. So before we start talking about it, I wonder, I know that you've long been a fan of Walt Whitman, that he's one of your favorites. How did you first come across him?
Just in class. When I was an undergraduate, I took a course in American poetry and we read a bunch of different things, Dickinson and so on. And I liked all those things, but Whitman was just super exciting from the get-go. And, in the same ways as we'll talk about a little bit later, Whitman wrote and rewrote and recompiled his major work, Leaves of Grass, over and over again. So too, it's a book that has stayed with me and looked different over time. So I read it when I was a teenager, but I read it again and again. And I don't think I've ever quite left it behind. It always seems new.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. I have a slightly different story with it. This is the first book of poetry that I bought.
Oh.
Which I bought when I was a teenager, I guess, 18, 19. And I decided I was going to start getting into poetry. And, I have a mind that can work very canonically sometimes. When I started listening to music, the first album I bought was by the Beatles because they seemed like the most important band.
Me too.
I bought Sgt. Pepper. It was the most boring choice in some ways. But similarly, I knew about Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass because of its reputation. I'm sure I had read bits of it here and there. But, it just seemed like the book to get. And it was available in a handy Bantam mass market paperback. Uh-huh. So it was very affordable for some of those of us on quite a budget.
Is that your very copy, one that you bought? This is my very copy.
Oh, very good.
Right? So we have them right in front of us.
Yeah. So I read it. I quite enjoyed it. It was fascinating to think with and wrestle with.
Did it speak to you? Did you feel seen, as it were?
Did I feel seen? I'm not sure that's how I would describe it. I felt overwhelmed. I felt, what's the nice way of saying invaded? I felt like Whitman was possessed, inhabited by this text, that it was reaching out and finding its way into me and working its rhythms into my rhythms. It was very interesting, but it was also a little overwhelming. And so I put it down after a while. I don't think I read the entire thing, but it is massive. And I went on to other books. I bought an Emily Dickinson collection next, I believe. And I never actually came back to it. It felt like a known quantity. But as I was rereading it for today, I realized that I have changed over the last however many years, and there are many different things that I can gain from the book now.
You said you had a lot of pleasure in reading that long sequence of poems, Song of Myself.
I did. I was reading it all in one sitting. It was a very long section. It would probably take about an hour to read it out loud, let's say. And yeah, it's just tremendous. It's we'll talk about it in a bit, but it's got such a vast scope and goes in so many different directions that it's just a really wild ride.
Yeah, finding the whole universe inside yourself, right?
Exactly. And in everyone else as well. So let's talk a little bit about Walt Whitman. Who was he?
Who was he not, right? So he, as you said, he's born on May 31st, 1819, dies at the age of 72 in 1892, born in New York out on Long Island, dies in Camden, New Jersey, where he's buried, and lives a lot of his life in Brooklyn, in Manhattan. So he's someone who a lot of his life is circumscribed in that tri-state area that you and I both grew up in as well. Though he spends also a certain amount of time traveling, and in particular spends time down south during the period of the Civil War. He started out working as a printer's devil, like an apprentice at a newspaper and then also in other print shops. So his other kinds of work, he also worked as a journalist, a teacher, a government clerk, and importantly, a volunteer nurse during the Civil War. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Leaves of Grass, when he publishes it, the first edition is self-published. He puts it together and gets it printed. There's no author's name on the title page in the first edition, which I think is super cool. There's a photograph of him instead. But once you start reading the poems, and in particular, once you read Song of Myself, which you were talking about a moment ago, his name shows up a few hundred lines in. Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshly, and sensual, right? So the author is named, but only inside the poems. Again, strikes me as a kind of extreme and interesting thing to do. So the work was praised, but it was also condemned. It was criticized also for being obscene. And this is something we're going to want to talk about. The poetry is very fleshly.
Yes.
And that can be understood in a positive, almost Edenic, like perfect kind of way. But you can also understand it in a dirty, obscene way. And that controversy affected his work. So the second edition almost didn't come out. And the other big thing I think that's worth talking about with Whitman is the Civil War experience. And this is something we'll talk about a bit, but there's an awful lot to say. Whitman had a number of brothers, and one of them was a soldier in the Union Army, and he sent letters describing his experiences, and these seem to have captured Walt Whitman's imagination. He traveled south to look for his brother, found him, but then was moved to go down and minister to soldiers. So he went down to Washington, D.C. He was there by the end of 1862, so about a little over a year into the war. And he worked part-time for pay in the Army Paymaster's office, but then the rest of the time he was volunteering as a nurse. And that experience, it's not just military service, right? It's caring for the bodies of the injured. It's a very particular kind of participation in warfare. And that's something we might think about as we're talking about the poems.
Yeah, especially because he wrote a series of poems that was originally published as its own book called Drum Taps, which is largely about his experiences over the course of the war. And much of the most interesting parts of it, for me at least, are about taking care of these soldiers.
I agree with you. And one of the things that's fascinating, the way Drum Taps starts out is, as you say, he publishes it shortly after the war. It's as a separate volume, right? Separate from Leaves of Grass. But then he clearly has a different way of thinking about it as time goes by. And as he produces additional editions of Leaves of Grass, Drum Taps finds its way into Leaves of Grass. It gets like integrated into the whole. And that seems to me a very interesting way of thinking about the book and the book of your life, like the extent to which your life is a whole and the extent to which your life is in different pieces. So Drum Taps is really interesting that way. And then he suffered poor health late in life, having a stroke. And one very charming detail, which I'm always really taken by, is as Whitman was more frail and needed some help around the house, a neighbor woman who was the widow of a sea captain came to keep house for him in exchange for free rent. And there's this lovely detail that apparently when she moved in, she brought her cat, a dog, 2 turtle doves, a canary, and other assorted animals. And I just feel that that's such a beautiful example of the world coming in to meet Walt where he sat.
Well, that's not the only example, of course. He was still writing poems, but his reputation was growing, and he had several people visit him and make pilgrimages, including perhaps most famously Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
Goes to America seemingly specifically to meet Whitman.
Yeah. He seems to be an incredibly charismatic figure.
Yeah.
Even in his own lifetime, but also afterward.
Well, you can see that in the poetry, certainly.
So Leaves of Grass really develops over time, and I find that just fascinating. You know, there are other works that did get revised and changed over time by their writers, but Leaves of Grass appears to have been something that grew along with him almost in a sense.
Yeah, we talked about how Frankenstein was changed over the course of Mary Shelley's life, but that was very small changes to it. Comparatively. This was taking a fairly slim volume of poetry and making it larger and larger and larger with each passing edition. So there were 9 editions that were published over the course of Whitman's life, depending on how you count them. The first one has just 12 poems. The next edition comes out the next year, and it's got 20 more poems. And then the following edition, a few years later, starts grouping them into these clusters, which by and large seems to set the template for what the overall shape of the book is going to be. But he continues to write, and he continues to add a few sections, and I believe he continues to add poems into the different sections or move a few poems around, even if the superstructure is largely set. As we said, he incorporates Drum Taps into it. He incorporates everything. It really feels like by the end of it that this book is a representation of his entire poetic project, is a representation of his life's work, and therefore everything needs to be in there.
Yeah, it's so funny you're saying using the word representation, and I keep thinking of words like diary or journal, and it's not like that. It's not like an account of his life. It's like almost like a parallel to his life or a manifestation. I don't have words to describe the ways in which it kind of parallels a human being.
Well, in Leaves of Grass, at several points, he describes the human body as a poem, or parts of the human body as poems, or lives as poems, and poems as lives, and poems as people. So he saw something similar about the construction and growth of the person in the construction and growth of poems. Yeah. So I think it makes a lot of sense for him to see this collection of poems as kind of a unity, even if it's made up of disparate parts. That's largely what drives his poetry in the first place.
Yeah. No, when you say that, it reminds me of this one particularly powerful moment, which shows up in the Calamus cluster, where it's a poem called Whoever You Are Holding Me Now in Hand. And so this is what the voice of that poem says. Or if you will, thrusting me beneath your clothing, where I may feel the throbs of your heart or rest upon your hip, carry me when you go forth over land and sea, for thus merely touching you is enough, is best, and thus touching you would I silently sleep and be carried eternally. So it's almost like the book is speaking to you as if it were a being.
Yeah.
It's weird.
So he continues expanding and adding to the book to the end of his life. The edition that we are mostly going to be working with is often referred to as the Deathbed Edition. It's from 1891 or 1892. It includes 2 annexes at the back, which seem to be just poems from his later years that he knew he was going to keep writing poems and he was going to keep including them. But it seems like
they hadn't found their place.
Yeah, or that he knew that this was maybe something different, that he wanted to keep writing, but also he didn't want to disturb this large text.
It was remaining as a work in progress, right? Maybe that's really important for him, that it's not closed and sealed and polished and finished the way another kind of work would be, comparing it to, I don't know, Milton's Paradise Lost or something like that, which is like polished and closed, or Dante or whatever. Right? Not like that.
Well, maybe we should start talking about what the text is like for people who haven't read Leaves of Grass.
And especially the feeling of reading it. I mean, this is something I was thinking about a lot getting ready for today. It seems to me that there's one thing that always strikes me as the awesome opening lines of so many of the poems. And I was like noting down some that really speak to me. There's one that starts, from pent up aching rivers. People may have heard of, I sing the body electric. It's a phrase that's kind of gone into more common usage. Out of the cradle, endlessly rocking. Another one that I love that has the same opening line, and the poem also closes with that line, warble me now for joy of lilac time, returning in reminiscence. There's just a rhythmical quality to so many of those opening lines, especially. It seems to me it's a very specific flavor of poetry. The other thing that is super noticeable, I think, in Whitman's poetry is the way in which he's speaking to you, calling to you, or the poem is speaking to you or calling to you. And those are 2 different voices that line up in interesting kinds of ways. Is that something that struck you about his poetry as well? Or what are the things that strike you most?
It does. I think also one of the things that we should point out, and then I think we'll be able to tie all these together, is that in a sense, even if you've never read Whitman, you've grown up in a post-Whitman age. So if you look at Whitman's poetry, you probably know what to expect, and it will probably feel normal, let's say, or like poetry at the very least.
Well, because free verse, right? Like, we live in a world where free verse is like a totally normal choice. And that was not the case when he was writing.
Exactly. It's one of those questions I've always had. Where exactly does this form? Or, quote unquote formlessness, but where does this idea that you can write lines of varying length with no fixed rhythm and call it a poem? How does that emerge? Like, people talk about how Walt Whitman is the founder of that, at least in the English tradition. And I mean, that's sort of true in an influence sense, but there are examples of what came before. But even those examples, I still have questions of. There is a fantastic poem by a poet named Christopher Smart from, I believe, the 1700s called Jubilate Año, which is in a very Whitman-esque style. It's really terrific. But that was not published until 1930s. So there's no way he knew about that. And then you can look back to certain sections of the Bible that were translated in something like this style, something like the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, is written in a very similar way. So you have translators like Wycliffe doing this in the 14th century. But there's still this is just a question I've always had. How does that get recognized?
I think it's such an interesting point. I keep thinking about what you were saying about free verse or, poetic form or lack of form. I mean, yes, it's not in a fixed verse form, but it's how can I put it? There's a controlling voice. There's a shape to the language. And for example, in Song of Myself, you really hear it. It's a very, how can I put it? It's not fixed verse form, but the language has a form. So listen to what this sounds like. I'm just going to read a few lines of it. A child said, "What is the grass, fetching it to me with full hands?" How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners that we may see and remark and say, "Whose?" Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic. I mean, I know that's free verse, but don't tell me there's no form there.
Oh, sure.
And I don't know how to talk about it.
So it is talked about in terms of coming out of preaching traditions, sermon traditions, very oral, musical. Very much with a kind of rhythm and a cadence that's not tied to the sort of iambic pentameter style, although it often carries a bit of a pulse in that.
In a very natural way, out of the cradle, endlessly rocking.
Yeah. It feels related to that form, but it is coming out of this other tradition. But yeah, that moment of hearing that preaching and writing it down in a form like this and saying this is a poem, even though it looks like nothing else that is called a poem or very little else that's called a poem, always strikes me as very strange. And it's a very hard strangeness to recognize now that this has become so much more familiar.
Yeah. And one of the features too that I think doesn't strike us as odd now, but must have stuck out in its own time was the way in which a third really striking feature of Whitman's poetry is that you have many long, sprawling, expansive poems, but you also have these short little, almost epigrammatic, teeny tiny little poems. And they're very different in a sense, but they're each serving their own purpose within the larger mosaic of Leaves of Grass. Like they're different kinds of leaves, right? Different size leaves, different shaped leaves, right?
Yes, and they vary the rhythm for an audience that you are orating to. This is very declamatory poetry, which is part of what I was getting at. So this is why you need a striking opening line, why you're often calling attention to the reader, why you often start with the, "Oh, comrade, oh, close, oh, you and me last." These declamations is very much coming out of those traditions.
Thou reader, right? You do this, right? Yeah.
So this is all tied up in the kinds of context. This is poetry meant to be read aloud, and if you read it on the page, it feels very much like you're reading it aloud. Like it's very hard, I think, not to hear it as a spoken text.
Now that you say this, maybe that's one of the reasons why I feel Whitman so much. Like I have so many feelings about Whitman is I always hear what I read. You know, people have different sort of synesthetic experience. I always hear what I read. If I'm reading carefully, I always hear it. Like it feels like I'm hearing it. And so when Whitman does something like at the end of his poem, "To a Stranger," okay, I just hear it in a deeply moving way. He says, "You give me the pleasure of your eyes, face, flesh as we pass. You take of my beard, breast, hands in return. I am not to speak to you. I am to think of you when I sit alone or wake at night alone. I am to wait. I do not doubt I am to meet you again. I am to see to it that I do not lose you." I can't not be overwhelmed by hearing that voice.
Well, we should perhaps actually hear his voice because weirdly enough, there is a recording of Whitman reading one of his shorter poems called America. He reads almost the entire poem. There's one line left off at the end. And I believe this was recorded at the Edison
on wax cylinder.
On a wax cylinder. And that's what we have.
Which is probably why it cuts off because the time's so limited.
Yeah, you only had so much time in a cylinder. So let's listen to that now.
America, center of equal daughters, equal sons, all alike and dear, grown, ungrown, young or old, strong, ample, fair, enduring, capable, rich, perennial with the earth, with freedom, law, and love.
Is that the voice you imagined Walt having? I'm sure you've heard this before. But...
The first time I heard it, no, but there are like words in there that, I don't know, he pronounces them so fully and so roundedly, all alike, strong, ample, right? They're this broad regional accents of my youth, right? I was brought up in northern New Jersey, right? So I hear those vowels in a very at-home kind of way. And you can imagine when the recording was being done, right? If you read that poem briskly, you could get it all in time for the wax cylinder, right? But he doesn't do that. He has every syllable full, right? So I find that really satisfying to hear.
Part of that is surely because of the early technology. You had to speak very loudly into a cone, and you needed to speak very slowly because the recording would end up so muffled otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But also, that makes perfect sense if you're imagining orating to a crowd, which I imagine Whitman was. Without microphones and a PA system, you'd similarly want to declaim with plenty of space to allow people to hear each word. So I assume that recording is fairly representative of how he imagined reading these poems.
Mm-hmm.
And first time I heard it, I found this it very weird. He's got a very weird way of sort of holding his voice, but the cadence made perfect sense. It wasn't what I would have guessed, but it made perfect sense.
We've talked already a little bit about the language of these poems, and I kind of identified a few moments that I pick up as being really expressive to me of what's the Whitman flavor of the poetic language. What are the things that speak to you in it? What are the things that strike you most?
Well, we've already talked about several of the most notable features, including its orality, the way it seems designed to be read aloud, the way it's written so that you don't end up with these tremendous clusters of consonants or hard to pronounce passages. But I have to say, one of my favorite things about the text, and one of the most recognizable Whitman-esque tricks, I guess, is the list.
He gets very listy sometimes.
He loves to list off things, and he does it, generally speaking, very well. He likes listing the names of places. He likes listing the things that he's seeing right now. He likes listing the people that he's imagining himself to be momentarily inhabiting before moving on to the next scene. He likes a lot of rhetorical devices that require repeating the same phrases, which comes off sometimes as kind of a list. One of the most talked about ones is from I Sing the Body Electric, where he lists body parts. It's a phenomenally long and exhaustive list of the body parts. Oh, my word, it's so long. And he just goes from sort of head to toe.
Yeah, let me read a tiny little bit of it, maybe. The skin, the sunburnt shade, freckles, hair, the curious sympathy one feels when feeling with the hand the naked meat of the body, the circling rivers, the breath, and breathing it in and out, the beauty of the waist, and thence of the hips, and thence downward toward the knees, the thin red jellies within you or within me, the bones and the marrow in the bones. The exquisite realization of health. Oh, I say these are not the parts and poems of the body only, but of the soul. I mean, it's the end of a long, long, long list of body parts, but one of the neat things he does, he says, these are not just the parts and poems of the body only, but also of the soul. We usually separate body and soul, like body's over here, soul's over here, right? There's this fallen quality over here and this divine quality over here. But for Whitman, these are all one thing.
Yeah.
And the listiness, therefore, has this almost devotional kind of quality. It's almost like, those prayers that consist in sort of repeating the many names of God over and over again or whatever, like in a litany kind of way. They're parts of the body, but they're also so much more than that.
That's a really interesting way of putting it. You're right. I think you're totally right. I think he is reciting then parts of the body in order to celebrate them and in order to make sure that they are incorporated, pun intended, I guess, that they're incorporated into the text. I want to, you read the very end of the long list. I want to read something much closer to the beginning, just to give a sample of how this starts. Head, neck, hair, ears, drop and tympan of the ears, eyes, eye fringes, iris of the eye, eyebrows, and the waking or sleeping of the lids, mouth, tongue, lips, teeth, etc. It goes on for many, many lines like that before we get to the more fleshed out, again, terrible puns, I guess, but the more fleshed out section that you read. So you have this bare list, which again, I think you're totally right in thinking of as a kind of devotional litany. It also reminded me of that passage that I pulled out from Paradise Lost of the creation of the earth, of the rocks and these monosyllables. And it's like, here are the substances. This is the thing.
The bedrock.
The bedrock and the way that just these lists of nouns, of very pure nouns, kind of gives a concrete weight. They're very weighty, right? You just have this thing, and it makes it more real.
Yeah, it almost calls it into being.
Exactly.
I know. And that brings me back to thinking about, those accusations of obscenity. We talked about before how when Leaves of Grass was first published in 1855, there was some praise, but there was also some outrage. And the second edition of 1856 almost didn't come out. And when we have these passages that describe the flesh, whether it's a list or something different in a very kind of luscious and capacious kind of way, are those beautiful or are those dirty? Like how do we negotiate that? And how did Whitman negotiate that? A couple of little passages in Song of Myself maybe give a good example of this. There's this one section fairly near the beginning. He says, "The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. So there's this very sensual description, but you can say, well, this is a description of a person's sense of their own body and nature. But then a little later on, it becomes even more intimate. He says, I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me, and parted the shirt from my bosom bone, and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart, and reached till you felt my beard, and reached till you held my feet. I know, it's so beautiful, but it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
So you can understand, but it's beautiful, but you can see how people would take it as obscene, right? And so what do you do with that? He's clearly committed to being a poet of the flesh, a poet of the body, and celebrating it and holding it up as a thing that is good and pure and a basis for communion, right? For people coming together. But that freaks people out, right?
Yeah. When you ask, what do you do with it? My response is, well, I celebrate it. It's fine.
No,
I have no problem with it.
But you can see why people were alarmed, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So. This is very, even though it's never quite explicit enough to be. Never quite. But it's definitely, it's absolutely there.
And there's this focus not just on the lusciousness of the body, the lusciousness of the flesh. You get a lot of that. But also there's this tremendous focus on something which is not quite the same thing, though it's aligned with it, fecundity and the urge for procreation and the urge for the passage of bodies through time, the regeneration of bodies through time. I mean, it's not quite the same thing as the lusciousness of the flesh, but it lines up with it in interesting ways, I think. This capaciousness is everywhere.
There are two sections of the poem, two clusters that really focus on sex, one more explicitly than the other.
Or in different ways.
Or in very different ways.
Yeah.
So there's one called Children of Adam, which you can imagine from the title, after having thought about Paradise Lost, is about the sexuality and sort of theoretically fallen state of man and women, but how sort of earthy and pure and part of man that is, and how that shouldn't be something to be embarrassed about.
Well, no, it's interesting thinking about Children of Adam, and then the other cluster that I think we might want to talk about, Calamus. These two clusters are, I think, very complementary in certain ways. They're both preoccupied with the nature of the body, the nature of desire, the nature of one human being as it relates to another human being. So not just the individual's relation to humanity as a whole, which Whitman at times talks about in this very universal kind of way, but one body with a second body. And in Children of Adam, the focus is very much on male-female relation and the procreative impulse, the kind of urgency for procreation and the generations that flow out from that. And some very beautiful language there. And then this other cluster, Calamus, is also about the relationship of one person to another person, one body to another body. But here it's about comrades. It's about male-male companionship. And appropriately, I think Calamus gets an awful lot of attention because that was a tremendous breakthrough, a real new vista in certain kinds of ways. But I think both clusters are extraordinary in their own way.
One of the interesting differences between the two sections is that the Children of Adam poems are very confident. They're very, I don't want to say aggressive, but they're not shy. And they're celebratory, and they're proud, and they're not boastful, but they're
unabashed.
Unabashed. That's exactly it. The Calamus poems,
they're
which
more
is
shy.
It's much more. That's a section that comes immediately after it in the text, and they are much more about not being able to talk about what you want and worrying about rejection in a way that is very resonant from how we think about the logic of the closet, from the idea of somebody who is closeted worrying about admitting to their secret love and can't imagine doing it. It's such an unexpected thing to come across when you've just finished reading Children of Adam.
Yeah, though even Children of Adam has those shy moments. There's this one poem called Spontaneous Me, and you get a real sense of that hesitancy. The real poems, he writes, what we call poems being merely pictures, the poems of the privacy of the night and of men like me, this poem drooping shy and unseen that I always carry and that all men carry, know once and for all, avowed on purpose, wherever are men like me, are our lusty lurking masculine poems.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's fascinating, but it's shy, right? It's very different from the exuberant generative quality that gets also emphasized in Children of Adam.
So one of the things that informed my reading of Calamus when I read it for the first time when I was 19-ish was reading it as a young gay man and having read in the literature about the text that this is where Whitman's gay stuff was, that this is the section that you wanted to read for all the hot gay stuff. And it's not. It was very disappointing for that as somebody who is hoping to find something liberatory, let's say. This feels much more constrained and closeted than anywhere else in the book that I've encountered. I'm not saying that there aren't good reasons for it, and I'm not saying that you can't read it appreciating that. But as somebody who was going to this as something that was meant to be a landmark in gay expression, which it is, I'm not trying to take that away from it, but it wasn't the landmark that I was hoping it would be. And it wasn't the landmark I was expecting it to be given Whitman's exuberance elsewhere.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think maybe that's the place where he's encountering those kinds of limits, how explicit you can be in the way in which you talk about desire. And so I think it's probably the case that the kind of exuberant expression of desire that you find over in places like Children of Adam, that's kind of this heteronormative framework, that stuff spilling over from elsewhere emotionally, I think.
One of the other themes that comes up a lot in the poems that this relates to is the question of freedom. Mm-hmm. He's very interested in people being free, the underdog throwing off their oppressor. He looks very sympathetically at slaves being sold at auction. And talks about their nobility. It's not an uncomplicated picture of what freedom is, but he has very much this sense of freedom that in a sense isn't rigorous, but does feel very American.
Yeah, he's deeply preoccupied with this, and I think there's an awful lot to say about it. In some ways, it's not hard to read Whitman as a poet who is celebrating freedom, who is celebrating a universal notion of American identity that is both universal within national identity, but has a even broader universalizing kind of impulse. You see this in poems like The Sleepers, for example, that evokes America, but also evokes this world scale. The sleepers are very beautiful as they lie unclothed. They flow hand in hand over the whole earth from east to west as they lie unclothed. The Asiatic and African are hand in hand. The European and American are hand in hand. Learned and unlearned are hand in hand. And male and female are hand in hand. So he's got this expansive capaciousness, but there's also all kinds of things that are problematic. It's been pointed out that Whitman's poetry, this universalizing impulse, this American unity that he's kind of celebrating, emerges from a not unproblematic period after the end of the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, where all kinds of commitments to liberty and freedom had to be contained in order to have that kind of American unity. So I say this not to condemn Whitman or to get him off the hook, but to just be really clear that he's in the celebration of American unity that we can derive from his poems is not unproblematic. It's not transparent.
No, and it's tied up in issues of manifest destiny. He truly believes, the entirety of the Americas should be under the United States' control. He includes Canada as if it were another state.
There's a nice example in the poem, Me Imperturb. He says, it opens this way, Me imperturb, standing at ease in nature, master of all or mistress of all. A little later on, he says, Me toward the Mexican Sea, or in the Mannahatta, or in the Tennessee, or far north, or inland, a riverman, or a man of the woods, or of any farm life of these states, or of the coast, or the lakes, or Canada, me wherever my life is lived. Oh, to be self-balanced for contingencies. So, I mean, he's not saying, well, the geopolitical borders have to be here, but the land is what drives the outward thrust, right? It's an expansive vision of a people and of a territory. So he doesn't get too bogged down in the borders. He's always reaching out toward the peripheries. And sometimes, as when he says Mannahatta, using language that is meant to signal the indigenous people's past. So he's at least in sort of aspirational terms trying to reach every kind of people who have inhabited this land. Again, not to idealize them at all, but that's the direction he's pushing in.
Well, and I think with the sense that the original peoples of the tri-state area are already incorporated into America, however that has turned out, that assimilation has already happened. They are already part of this beautiful...
In a brutal way, right, in his own lifetime.
Yeah. But that assimilation is already part of the American project, and he is so fond of and takes so much inspiration from what he sees as the best parts of the American project, this kind of commitment to freedom and capaciousness, that why wouldn't you want to be in it? Mm-hmm. It is only a good thing, I think he would argue, for this to be spread, for more peoples and more land to enter into.
Mm-hmm. Radical openness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But very much on America's terms.
Well, yeah. And I think a place where you see this tension there's a couple places where you see this tension in a and I think a very unnerving kind of way, where there's this push toward expansiveness and inclusion and breadth and universalizing, right? Which also does not pause to reckon with the terrible traumas and terrible destruction wreaked on people with regard to African Americans, right? With regard to Black people and with regard to Native Americans. So for example, in his poem, I Sing the Body Electric, part 7 and part 8 open in this way. Part 7 opens a man's body at auction. Part 8 opens a woman's body at auction. And it goes on like this. a woman's body at auction, she too is not only herself. She is the teeming mother of mothers. She is the bearer of them that shall grow and be mates to the mothers. Have you ever loved the body of a woman? Have you ever loved the body of a man? Do you not see that these are exactly the same to all in all nations and times all over the earth? If anything is sacred, the human body is sacred. Now, on the one hand, this is expansive and capacious and saying it's an abomination to be selling a person, a human being, a human body at auction. But it's also not reckoning with, like it's not accounting for, it's not doing some of the hard work of blame and why that, there's a lot it's not saying. And so I don't mean to get hung up on, is Whitman good or bad, but I think he invites us to interrogate him. There are other comparable moments where I find them troublesome, like I find them beautiful still, and I see the positive vision there, but I also see the problems.
I think this is one of the potential downsides with the list technique, because the list doesn't usually allow you to go deeply into any item on that list. You're noticing it. It is what it is. It is a thing in front of you that you're describing and maybe giving some context to, giving an action perhaps, but you can't tell its entire history. You can't interrogate it too deeply, especially when you're trying to include all of the list. So Whitman seems to be falling for the common trap of thinking in universals and ignoring the particulars that people actually live under.
Well, he's going to give you the particulars. He's going to see every last little thing and number it and list it, right? But he's not going to get engaged in analysis. He's not going to get engaged in argumentation. He's going to show you, but he's not going to unpack what lies behind it. I don't know if that's a deliberate move, but there's an awful lot that is unsaid. So much is said. There's also so much that is unsaid.
Well, let's talk a bit about the section that we mentioned earlier, Drum Taps, his Civil War sequence, which was originally, as we said, published as its own book and does sort of stand on its own. It has an arc to it. The first poem, First O Songs for a Prelude, is a depiction of the moment that the war broke out and being in New York, and suddenly news has broken up in a sort of movie-style depiction of suddenly everybody is signing up to fight in the war, and everybody is raising the war effort, and how marvelous and manly and exciting this is. And this is a position that he starts with, but it's a position that over the course of the book and over the course of the war, he comes to have a lot of nuance for, and even later in one of the poems, regrets his early enthusiasm for it, because it has led to so much death and so much destruction of so many young men in particular. It's particularly interesting because we tend to think of Whitman as kind of writing in the moment. And so when you read a poem like that first poem, you imagine him writing immediately after the war has broken out. He just diaristically writes down what the feelings were like that day, what his position is that moment. And he's got a record of it, which he includes in his poems. And then later he has a different feeling and he writes that poem down. And he's willing to include both of them. But we don't often give Whitman the authorial ability to have written that first poem after the second poem, to have written that first poem later so that it can set up the second poem, which I think is very interesting about how we read these seemingly spontaneous spoken declamatory poems as if they are uncrafted.
He invites you to hear them as if they're spontaneous.
Yeah.
That's right.
And as if they are true and untouched records, even though we know he's been editing the book. I don't know what the editing history of Drum Taps or these poems are, but I know that he would go back and revise the poems and add in sections and change things. So the possibility that he has changed his mind about something like, is it wonderful that we're entering into this war? Is what really struck me this time around.
Yeah, I find some aspects of Drum Taps really accessible and some aspects very inaccessible. The parts I find most accessible are the parts where he's really reckoning with the human cost of war, where, again, he's preoccupied with love and even desire and, the relationship of one body to another body. But it's not in the context of sexuality. It's in the context of, it's not that it's asexual, right? But it's not about sexual congress, right? It's about love expressed through the flesh, through the body, but here through nursing someone who is at the point of death. There's a beautiful example from Drum Taps, a poem that starts out with the words, "Vigil strange." Part of it goes this way. "Vigil final for you, brave boy. I could not save you. Swift was your death. I faithfully loved you and cared for you living. I think we shall surely meet again. Till at latest lingering of the night, indeed just as the dawn appeared, my comrade I wrapped in his blanket, enveloped well his form, folded the blanket well, tucking it carefully overhead and carefully under feet, and there and then, bathed by the rising sun, my son in his grave, in his rude dug grave, I deposited. Ending my vigil strange with that, vigil of night and battlefield dim, vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding, vigil for comrade swiftly slain, vigil I never forget, how as day brightened I rose from the chill ground and folded my soldier well in his blanket and buried him where he fell. I mean, it's deeply moving, and it's deeply enfleshed, right? This loving tucking in and folding and holding and kissing, right? But it's deeply poignant, right? Because this is a beloved that he's had to bury. So those are the aspects of drum taps that I find accessible, and maybe it's because I don't have quite as much of a affective sense. Like I don't have as much of a way into some of the other aspects of that. It just shows you how capacious Whitman is, right? Like he has something for almost everybody.
That's very true. Yeah, I agree. I was particularly struck on this reading by the wound dresser, which is it's about him tending to these wounded soldiers as he did. And this is where he starts talking about his regrets. Early on, it says, in a parenthetical, it says, aroused and angry, I'd thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war, but soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead. Even his own change of mind is being fleshed out here. It's reflected in his face drooping and his fingers failing. And this entire poem is filled with parentheticals, which is not uncommon in Whitman's poetry, but there's a lot of them in this poem. And
these are not just second thoughts. These are like interior thoughts. Like there's these layers of interiority. There's the thing you think, and there's the thing you think a bit more privately. The very layered consciousness there, right?
Yeah. And it ends with a parenthetical. Yeah, it ends. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips. With a sense of like that's what remains of these soldiers that he's known and tended towards.
It's like an echo almost. Yeah.
He's carrying them. He's carrying them with that deathbed kiss. And so and now he's telling you about them. It's a really remarkable collection, and it's interesting to see that it has that arc in it. One of the striking things I find about Leaves of Grass is that it's almost a fractal of a poem. If you read Drum Taps or if you read Song of Myself, it is almost like having read the entire book. And even within it, some of the shorter sections manage to take the same kind of arc. Like it's constantly repeating at different scales this similar motion and doing it in different ways and sometimes, with a very different effect. But broadly speaking, you always feel like you are in the middle of Leaves of Grass wherever you are in Leaves of Grass.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly the feeling it produces.
I mean, it does have very diverse texts, and even though at the same time they often do feel the same, and especially some of the less exciting poems in the collection, you look at it and you're like, yep, that's something Whitman wrote one day. and he included it because he had a poetics of hoarding and collecting and gathering and list making, and seemingly he wasn't going to let any of his little babies go away. But nevertheless.
But when he's on, he's on.
And you're just in it, and you're always in it. It is really a book that you can more or less pick up anywhere and feel like you know where you are.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Though if someone's dipping into it for the first time, starting with maybe Song of Myself, maybe either Calamus or Children of Adam, like those are great points of entry, I think.
Yeah, I would even suggest reading the very first few very short poems in the inscriptions that open it, which give you a sense of the project, and then reading Song of Myself. And a fantastic way to start. And maybe not starting with the most famous poems in the collection, which are still quite nice, but there are a set of poems in it that are especially famous because they're poems that he wrote about Lincoln after Lincoln's death.
Yeah, especially when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed.
And Oh, Captain, My Captain.
And Oh, Captain, My Captain. Which I find both of those have lovely lines, but I find them both very inaccessible. Like some of Whitman's poetry, I feel like I'm climbing into a warm bath or, like it's just satisfying and pleasurable. Those poems I find harder. I don't know about you.
I find Oh, Captain, My Captain kind of interesting. It's the one poem in the book that rhymes.
Yes, that's
which
true.
Which is and it rhymes perfectly well. It feels like it's based off a kind of ballad or drinking song sort of structure. But I feel like I can get behind that. It's universalized enough. But the way that When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is universalized is really weird because it is about Lincoln. Like it's very much about Lincoln. Although I don't remember if he's named. But it's always the man I love.
Yeah, it opens like this. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring, lilac blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. A lot to say about that opening, the rhythmical quality of it, the biblical cadence of it. You're mentioning biblical translation as a kind of backdrop to Whitman's poetry. You hear it there very profoundly. And the idea that it's a cycle. The mourning is collective and individual, and it's now and perennial. It will happen again and again and again. So this is, I think, part of Whitman's participation in the nation rebuilding project after the end of the Civil War.
It is interesting to think about these kinds of moments of national mourning. And I imagine Lincoln's death was actually much more complicated than that after all the Civil War was barely over. And I'm sure much of the nation was not entirely on board with Lincoln.
No, I mean, everything was in flux at that moment, right?
But nevertheless, as we've seen with Princess Diana's death, for example, just the way that a collective fellow mourning gathers around these events must have been very much Whitman's kind of thing. It is very much this universalist feeling of mourning. It's a collective, all different types of people gathering together to mourn together. In some ways, it feels like the funeral and the public grief must have been kind of like the effects he was going after in some of his poetry.
Well, it's weird in some ways, right? Because there's a continuity there, but there's also this tremendous disjunction, right? Like if you think about the poems in Leaves of Grass before the assassination of Lincoln, right? If you're thinking about humanity and the communal nature, the thing that brings people together in this universalizing kind of way, it's either the fact of being in flesh, the thing that we all share, or it's Whitman's own body, where he's situating himself as a kind of a crossroads, like you were saying in Drum Taps, where the memory or the echo of the kisses of all those soldiers he's looked after remain on his lips, right? So he's the bodily crossroads, so to speak. But with this poem, with When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, and also maybe Oh Captain, My Captain, he's situating Lincoln in that kind of crossroads role as the focus of a kind of shared affective experience. And it's also kind of a martyrdom narrative, right? I mean, he's not inventing that, but he's definitely participating in that. And that seems to be very different from the ways in which communal experience is being understood through the body elsewhere. This we need to think about more.
Yeah. So we thought it would be interesting to bring in some other voices into our thoughts about Walt Whitman's poetry. And you in particular found a very striking volume of essays responding to Whitman's work, an academic collection of essays, right?
Yeah, it's terrific. It's called Whitman Noir. And in some ways, this conversation emerges from things we've been talking about earlier today, about the extent to which we can see the positive, universalizing, inclusive urge in Whitman, but we can also recognize all kinds of politically weird, complicated aspects to the ways in which he reckons or does not reckon with those kinds of histories that are before him in the 1850s and 1860s. But it also connects back to something that we've kind of alluded to, but haven't really drawn out, the extent to which Whitman invites the reader to interact with him. He calls out to the reader and people respond. I mean, if you look at the number of poems and other kinds of writing where authors have written explicitly to Whitman, like a letter to Whitman, an ode to Whitman, there are like a bajillion of these. And he's asked for it, and so it's such a remarkable thing. I always think the extent to which he calls out and then also the extent to which people respond and the ways in which they respond. The Whitman Noir volume is particularly interesting. Its full title is Whitman Noir, Black America and the Good Gray Poet. And it's a collection that Ivy Wilson put together in 2014. And it does something really fascinating, I think. In Wilson's words in the introduction, she says, the volume's purpose is to explore the meaning of blacks and blackness in Whitman's imagination, and equally significant, to also illuminate the aura of Whitman in African-American letters. And this seems to be such an interesting thing to do because she and the essays collected there are not letting Whitman off the hook, right? They're going to engage with him critically and seriously, but they're also not going to push him away because he's also speaking to them, speaking with them. They're speaking with him. And the way she puts it, to illuminate the aura of Whitman, seems to me a really sensitive way of phrasing that. She's not going to talk about the influence of Whitman. She's not going to talk about adaptation of Whitman even. She's going to talk about the thing that happens when writers come up against other writers. So the essays in there are absolutely fabulous. One that really stood out to me and I really liked was by June Jordan, who's an activist and writer, a poet, and also an essayist, that she wrote in 1980. And she puts this so beautifully when she says, I too am a descendant of Walt Whitman, and I am not by myself struggling to tell the truth about this history of so much land and so much blood, of so much that should be sacred and so much that has been desecrated and annihilated boastfully. I mean, the whole essay is really cool, but it really strikes that note of criticism and also doing a thing together that's kind of moving. And the essays in there engage with some of that rich poetic tradition of answering back. Some of the poems in Spanish, for example, there's an ode to Walt Whitman by Garcia Lorca and another one by Neruda a little later on by the same title, Ode to Walt Whitman, responding both to Whitman and to Lorca. There are essays in there that talk about that in the context of Black American poetic reception. And probably the most famous poem that emerges as an intertext over and over again in the volume is Langston Hughes's poem, I Too. That's one you know, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's super famous,
yes.
right? And it strikes a really neat kind of note, right? Because on the one hand, it came out in 1926. It's also critical, but it's also engaged, right? It's a short poem. It starts out, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. And it concludes, I too am America. Right. So in some ways, it's a rebuke to Whitman. It's like, not just you, me too. I am also America. Right? I can also stand in this place. But it's also engaging with Whitman. And in this collection, Whitman Noir, Wilson mentions this lovely detail, which I hadn't known before, that in his autobiography, Langston Hughes writes that when he took off on his travels to Africa and Europe, he threw all of his undergraduate textbooks from Columbia overboard, and he only kept one of them, which was Leaves of Grass.
Right.
So Hughes is going to be critical, but he's not going to throw Leaves of Grass overboard. And I think it's a beautiful kind of emblem.
Do the authors in that collection who talk about this Hughes poem, do they read it as directed towards Whitman? Because as if Whitman had not included him, or is it written towards America?
That's an interesting question. I think the latter. I mean, the essays in the Whitman Noir volume engage with Hughes in different kinds of ways, but I think that's exactly right. While there are certain poems that are addressed explicitly to Whitman, like Garcia Lorca, like Neruda, like Mark Doty writes a letter to Walt Whitman. Ginsberg speaks to Walt Whitman in his poetry. Like, unlike those, Hughes is doing something a little different. It's almost like he's standing alongside Whitman and saying something to the people who are listening to Whitman, say, no, you should be listening to me also.
Do the essayists talk about how Whitman has influenced them as writers or as thinkers? What sort of pathways he's opened up for them?
Well, they do, and sometimes in extraordinarily affective terms. One that really struck me this way is the very last essay in the volume, which is by George Hutchinson, who talks about Whitman's work, but he also talks about an experience he had where he went off looking for Whitman's tomb. And he talks about finding it, the complicated experiences in getting there. And he says this right near the end. He says, suddenly it occurred to me that the proper thing was not to look at the tomb at all, but to look out from it. Mm-hmm. So I walked back down to the left corner of the tomb and sat in the leaves. As I sat there next to the entryway, I looked all around, just waiting, letting in the day. And then I saw a corner of the pond I'd been circling around as I was waiting for the tomb to choose me. A pond. I nearly said it out loud. Right? So this idea of you're looking for the tomb that stands in the place of Whitman, but what you ultimately do is you inhabit the place and you look at the things that he might have seen or might see or might invite you to see. It's such an interesting move. So it's not explicitly talking about the poetry at all, but it's saying something about the poetry.
It is. And it's a fascinating moment of being invited to see things, so to speak, from his perspective or inviting you to look from where he would have you look, but still see things with your own eyes. Mm-hmm. That there is a kind of independence and collective nature to that moment, which seems very lovely and Whitmanic to me.
Well, that the individual and the collective is always there, always in tension, always connected.
Well, that sounds like a really fantastic collection. Now I'm curious, has Whitman affected or influenced your writing or thought processes?
Well, totally affected by thought processes, as you can tell, in every possible way. As I said, I find it very enchanting the ways in which Whitman reaches out to readers and then readers reach back. So, for example, there's a poem he writes very late in his career called So Long. And this is the end of that poem, So Long. He says, "Dear friend, whoever you are, take this kiss. I give it especially to you. Do not forget me. I feel like one who has done work for the day to retire a while. So long. Remember my words. I may again return. I love you. I depart from materials. I am as one disembodied, triumphant, dead." So there's this reaching out that happens over and over again. And then writers reach back, right, in all different kinds of ways. There's this poem by Mark Doty where he starts out, "Dear Walt, you answer me as the dead do." Right? this sort of answering back happens all the time. I mean, for me, I'm fine at writing nonfiction, like writing essays and things like that. I'm not good at writing poetry, but he invites you to do it. So there was this one point, I remember I was on a train from New York to Philadelphia, going off to see my lover, right? And I just could hear Whitman's voice in my head, right? And so I wrote this poem that was just like speaking to Walt Whitman and answering him, right? And it's ridiculous, right? It's an adolescent urge, but he asks you to do it. I mean, I'd been reading him and he's talking to you, so you answer. It's a silly adolescent thing, but for me, it was kind of really moving, and that piece of paper still lives in my old beat up copy of Leaves of Grass, right? It's really moving because I feel together with all the people who wanted to answer back to him. And so that's like a really pleasurable thing, right? So it's like, obviously you don't know Whitman, right? You don't know any of these people, but you feel like you're connected, you're linked to this kind of chain, which is very moving.
Yeah. It's interesting. As I said early on, I felt so overwhelmed and overtaken by the strength of his personality and his poetic voice. So I never wrote a letter back to Whitman or anything like that. Never wrote a poem for him. But I will say that his use of the list and his sense of a capaciousness and this idea that poetry can and should incorporate the world and be one with the world and be in many ways synonymous with it, really stuck with me. And so the kind of omnium gatherum, everything can find a place into this, look through things and just see what can fit.
Where it's encyclopedic, right? It's everything. Yeah.
That I think really, I don't know whether that inspired that side to some of my poetic attempts or whether it just resonated really well with it and encouraged me to continue thinking along those ways. But I feel like that was one of the most powerful things I got out of encountering Whitman so early. Well, this was the first book in our cluster on America. The next book that we're going to be doing is the autobiography of Malcolm X, written by Malcolm X and Alex Haley, which is another very large book. And it's one that I haven't read before. So I've got a lot of homework to do before we get back. I've always meant to, but
I think you'll really enjoy it. I've read it a number of times and my son's read it more recently. And he also, I think, really responded powerfully to the book. There are a lot of different things to say about it. I think it'll be interesting to be reflecting on the kinds of things we were seeing in the Whitman Noir volume and thinking about where Malcolm X is situating himself relative to not just the political environment of the U.S., but also the cultural baggage of the U.S. and what it means to write an autobiography in that moment. I mean, he's doing it collaboratively together with Alex Haley, but there's more than one voice there. And the other thing that might be kind of interesting to reflect upon is this question of self-writing. That is autobiography. We might think back to the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas and how that played out with Gertrude Stein, but also self-writing, because Leaves of Grass is self-writing as well.
Well, it has been lovely to revisit Walt and to get to talk about him.
Yeah, I think he's happy that we're talking about him on his birthday.
I imagine so. Happy Walt's birthday, everybody. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. Show notes with links for this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/10. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
we'll see you again at the Spouter-Inn.
Happy birthday, Walt.
Happy birthday.